So Carole has literally just landed in on the flight from Far and Four, and for the last half an hour anyway, Juno and I have been worrying desperately. There was another guest arriving in last night. I got a text, Myrn, please ring them, let them know there's a funeral on the road at Inch and we're going to be 10 minutes late to collect them. So our whole fear was whether there was going to be a funeral on the road at Inch. But anyway, Carole has got here.
I love it. What a great arrival that is.
We're very grateful.
Well, it's fabulous to be back, I have to say. It was such a great festival last year.
So tell us, what has the year been like?
We have failed to get justice or to bring down Facebook, but we've had a good go. So that's been quite worthwhile. It's just been, I don't know, it just sort of goes on and on, doesn't it? With any of this stuff, you sort of feel, I mean, I've sort of felt from the beginning that, you know, you do the thing which journalists are supposed to do, and that we publish these stories, are really difficult to publish, and we show the wrongdoing, and, you know, that we reveal all this stuff and these crimes and this overspending and this data abuse. And then you sort of think, right, we've done our bit, and now you hand it over to the authorities. And, you know, and then it's up to the authorities to do their job. And really the kind of the key learning, really depressing learning of this year is that the authorities don't seem to have done their jobs. And this thing which is such a sort of overwhelming theme right now is this thing of nobody gets held to account. And I found that kind of quite difficult, actually, that feeling of that even though you've revealed all this stuff, and, you know, it's incredibly difficult to find the evidence, and it's incredibly difficult to publish, and then even when you do, it doesn't really have any impact, and people just seemingly just get away with it. So that's my cheery, uplifting little starter, just to kick off.
And obviously one of your major points here last year, Carole, was that the electoral laws were not fit for purpose in a digital age. Peter, we've now, and as Carole said, with electoral laws unamended and wrongdoing in previous voting unaddressed, we're now in a second general election, which is in the UK, which is ostensibly about Brexit. But Brexit doesn't seem to be featuring, again, very heavily.
Well, I think the big theme has been this kind of disinformation. We've seen a huge amount of it. We had, I'm sure, quite a few people in the audience would have seen it. Last week we had a debate between the leaders of the various parties, and the Conservative Party rebranded their Twitter account as Fact Check UK. And when they were called out on this, they completely doubled down. Dominic Raab, who was the Foreign Secretary, said, you know, people don't give a toss about social media, which begs the question why you would then go and rebrand your Twitter account in the first place if they don't. And Michael Gove basically said, we'll do it again. Yesterday, the BBC was complaining, put in a complaint against the Conservative Party because they basically cut up their footage and were using it online. Yeah. So basically the biggest party in British politics and the history of British politics is a disinformation node. And I think that's it's a big step change actually from 2017. I think it's quite easy to see these things as and I think a lot of the press corps in London have kind of seen this as what's the really big deal here? Is it a really big deal? Like people have always done kind of dodgy things. People have put silly bar charts on, on election material, all that kind of thing. But actually this is a huge step change. And one of the big things is, yes, there's no laws. So basically, if you get a leaflet through your letterbox, it has to say who paid for and all the rest of it. You can put anything you want online. You don't have to put an imprint on it. You don't have to do anything about it. And what's really kind of worrying is a lot of people who should really care about this aren't. I was at a thing in the Institute of Government in London a couple of days ago, and the head of the Electoral Commission, Sir John Holmes, was there, and there was a group of people there. Liz Carolan, who's done great work in Ireland, was on the panel. But what was really striking was the person from the Electoral Commission was the one going, we don't even know if this stuff works. People are getting worried about dark money and disinformation. Maybe it's all a bit of nothing. And I think it's a really worrying kind of place to be. And British politicians, like politicians in Ireland and all over countries, it's easy to kind of finger the Tories, but actually across the piece, all the politicians kind of think there's something in it for them, and that's why they do this. And they don't really want to change the rules because they kind of think, well, maybe they might benefit from the rules. So maybe I know how to bend this rule. Maybe it'll help me in my seat, etc., etc. So nobody really wants to do anything about it, and we're kind of getting to quite a dangerous place because it's not just about elections; it's about trust and it's about faith and democracy and all of those big things. And you can see that in Britain, because you're asking, is it an election about Brexit? In some ways, it's like, I'm not sure what it's an election about at all. I don't know how, living in Britain at the moment, me both in London for most. I know, look, I live there too. I could always, maybe I could go back to Longford if they'd still have me. Maybe I will. But, what is it?
I think they'll have you.
If they'll have me. But there's a huge problem, because actually you can see across the electorate there's a huge sense of a lack of trust. And it's because politicians are abusing and spreading disinformation.
And Donie, deepfakes came across your path so Donie, just for everybody's audience, is the curry man. We're outside. The photograph has been taken. It was practically a genuflection. He's big in New York. And Donie, will you tell us about your work at CNN over the last number of years?
Yeah.
Deepfakes, you've been hacked. Roger McNamee was this week lauding your response to Facebook's response to Sacha Baron Cohen's denunciations last weekend.
Yeah. I guess the job I do at CNN didn't really exist 3 years ago. I think after the 2016 election in the US, it was really the wake-up call for both US politicians, but also the American media that, oh wait, this whole social media Facebook thing can actually have a major impact on political discourse, on elections. But we always sort of had reporters who were covering tech and reporters who were covering politics, but they weren't ever much talking to each other.
Yeah.
So now my sort of role is looking at how Facebook and Twitter and all these companies are being used in the political process, whether it's by the likes of, established parties doing downright disinformation, but then also the likes of Russia or Iran or other countries that are targeting specifically US voters to try to achieve some ends. And then also looking at all of that is, I guess a bit of a buzzword recently, but is deepfakes, which if people here don't know what deepfakes are, they're sort of these super realistic fake videos where you can make it look like Peter has said something stupid, which he'd never say anything stupid.
Yeah, that would never happen.
You can take somebody's voice and you can essentially make it sound like...
This is Hollywood studio level
Absolutely.
editing.
But now you can do it in the sort of comfort of your own home. And so there's concerns about that, of how, just as we're getting used to what is happening on Facebook, and clearly these social media companies still don't have a handle on, just the basic, quote-unquote, fake news articles. How are they going to cope and deal with if there's a fake tape of a politician that comes at a critical moment in an election? And will they allow that to spread, and how will that spread? So looking at all that. And I think the point that Peter made was interesting, is in that, we, in the US particularly, I think some Americans, maybe might have took comfort. I mean, it was easy to blame the Russians for everything that happened. You know what I mean? And people were looking at what was happening on social media to say, this is Russia, 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 which a lot of it was. But now we're starting to see that it's actually a lot more domestic actors who are using those tactics.
And you were bringing through there, Peter, the third-party sites, which have really come into consciousness now, even in the last few weeks in the UK. You add on top of that the deepfake piece, and back to your point about a trust, what is the default then in terms of a level of trust or lack of trust, and what does it portend? I mean, we were here in the climate change discussion a little earlier, and I asked some of the panelists, can democratic societies vote this change? What we're talking about here begs the question of democratic elections in any sense in which we've known them.
Yeah, I think it is a huge issue. Like, we did a story on Open Democracy this week about a guy called Thomas Borick, a man that Carole knows very well. And this is a guy, he's a young man, used to work, he was a consultant with Cambridge Analytica. He was the chief technology officer on the Vote Leave campaign, the campaign that broke the law numerous times during the Brexit referendum. And now he runs a political consultancy in...
Is that his bit in the referendum here?
Yeah, well, he was. He worked against Repeal the 8th. He was on the anti-repeal side. He did social media for them as well. And so Thomas Borwick decides the other day to buy a bunch of Facebook ads, as he does. And he buys them through a company called Third Party Limited, which literally does what it says in the tin. And he buys a bunch of Green Party ads, ads in front of the Green Party. Thomas Borwick is a vice chairman of a Conservative association. His mum is a former Tory MP. His dad is the head of a Tory donor club. And look, he decides to buy, just as you would do, buy some Green Party ads. And he puts these out in various places saying, vote for the Green Party, in various target seats, various constituencies where the mainly marginals between the Conservative Party and the Lib Dems are between the Conservative Party and Labour, and that's all totally fine. And basically that's an attempt, it's voter suppression. What you're trying to do there is to try and dissuade people from voting. And it's quite interesting. There's a lot of stuff. We don't really know still what the effect of this kind of advertising
works
is.
or doesn't work.
We don't, but we actually, if you look at the academic work, the stuff the strongest support for is actually for stopping people, either for voting or for voting for certain parties. And that's really worrying, because it means that we're probably going to go down a line more and more, less about people trying to get voters out. And I think we saw this in 2016 in the States as well. Less about trying to get people to go out and vote for Donald Trump, more about trying people not to go out and vote for Hillary Clinton. And that's a really, especially and increasingly, a lot of politics is two-party systems. Even in Ireland, a lot of places would be one party or the other are going to win. And this is a really worrying thing, because what you do then is you try and erode trust. What you're really trying to do is erode trust in one party or another party. But what you end up doing, I think, a lot is eroding trust in the system itself. Yeah. And we're seeing that more and more. I'm always really struck, everyone, they're all the same. Politicians all lie. They're all. This is the really overwhelming, the kind of big narrative we have, especially in Britain at the moment. It's all, you can't trust any of them, and that's kind of not. That's probably not most people whose experience of actual elected representatives is. There's good ones and there's bad ones. It's like anything in life, and it's probably kind of quite cross-party. But what you're seeing is, as this trust gets eroded more and more, it's very likely that people can come along, like the Brexit Party, and win 30% of the vote by basically just saying, look, vote for us. And what's really interesting is you can kind of, like Donald Trump does, you can almost make a virtue of your untrustworthiness. There was a great clip on the BBC documentary recently in Panorama, I think it was a Panorama. David Dimbleby did one of those things. He goes around England trying to find out, how do people vote? And he goes to Myrta Tilfel in Wales. And he goes to this hairdresser, and he's talking to the hairdresser, and she's saying, I voted Leave. I always voted for Labour. Similar story, now I'm going to vote for Conservatives. Why are you going to vote for them? Boris Johnson's a liar. And she goes, yeah, I know he's a liar. That's really good. It shows he's human. What do you do with that?
Donie, I will ask you, what do you do with that? But before I ask you that, I will, from your observation of the people at the top of these companies, which is a really narrow, I was about to use the word cross-section, but that would obviously completely invalidate what I'm about to say, a very narrow group of people that within the span of the last 10 years of their careers have seen and overseen the effects of what we're talking about. What is their worldview that takes out of their view the question that Peter just asked? From your viewing of the animal.
Well, I think, what's been interesting, I sort of spend my days dealing with Facebook, people from all across the corporation, and Carole and Peter, but Carole especially has had a lot of dealings with folks there. But I do find that no matter whether you come to them as a journalist or a lawmaker or a researcher, an academic, you'll often get this sort of answer, well, you don't fully understand what you're talking about. It will be the sort of veiled response of saying, well, we're doing it this way because we do this, this, and this, and so what your criticism isn't really valid because. And that was the same, a few weeks ago, and it's sort of surreal to say it, but the former Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom now works for Facebook. And he's the guy, Nick Clegg, who's out there announcing and saying, if you're a politician, give us your millions and you're allowed to spread targeted lies on our platform. We won't fact check your ads. Which is also just remarkable when you think of sort of all the investment they've supposedly done in fighting misinformation. But I thought what was interesting recently was, this sort of sparked a whole debate in the US about, well, should these platforms be allowed to take money to not only spread lies, but spread targeted lies? So, the reason why Facebook is so valuable is because they likely have a profile on every person in this room. And they can even, well, I see some people shaking their heads, but if you're not on Facebook, they also have profiles on folks. But but they can, they might say, well, you're interested in X, Y, and Z, and also identify 3 other people in the room who are interested in that same thing, and just target ads specifically at you. But if you take that in the political context, if I can target one lie at you and one lie at somebody else, I can totally shape and change your perception of reality. And if you run an ad in a newspaper or on television, that ad is seen by a lot of people. It's also seen by your political opponents, it's seen by the press, and there's a chance there it can be fact-checked and called out. It sort of disincentivizes lying in some ways. Now, Facebook will say, oh, well, we built this archive where you can see all our political ads and all that. But even Facebook's own people are calling bullshit on that. And internally, a few weeks ago, the New York Times reported on a letter that was sent by just a few hundred staff in Facebook to Mark Zuckerberg and the leadership there saying, look, we don't think you should allow people to spend money to lie. And we also think you need to cut back on how you can target political ads. Because for the exact point of saying, I think a lot of people still think, oh, well, what's in a few Facebook posts? It doesn't matter. But Facebook and Twitter and all these platforms are now becoming how a lot of us, most of us, see the world, right? Perceive the world through. We spend more time on our phones than talking to the people sitting next to us. So Facebook's own employees said, you got to cut down this targeting thing. You can't specifically target very specifically.
And any response?
Well, muted. But what's interesting about it is that the Democratic Party in the US, which has spent the past few years bashing Facebook, when Google announced last week, sort of hearing all the criticism of targeting, Google said, okay, we're going to limit how you can target ads in the US. Of course, Trump's campaign, which runs this really sophisticated targeting operation, they came out straight away and said, this is BS, we want to be able to target ads the way we want to. But so too did the Democrats.
Yeah.
Because the Democrats use these tools in the same way. Maybe not to lie, but they use it to segment the population.
Yeah.
So, it's all fine to throw criticism until it lands on your doorstep, and then it's how to act.
And maybe to go back to a point there that you were making, Peter. So in effect, what we're talking about is advertising companies. And much of what they are advertising is not to do with politics. But we don't even know that any of that stuff works in terms of the selection effect and the advertisement of, in some sense, this is all collateral damage of another game that isn't clear it even works for them anyway.
I guess, I always think that kind of focusing on whether it works or not kind of it does risk missing the question. I think it's about what's really worrying, and it's interesting what Donie's saying there about the Democrats, as happens a lot, politicians don't want to change. They don't want to they see some advantage in this. And I think that's a big thing. There's also another kind of point that's related to that too, is that there's a danger that we all end up adopting what an American standard for our democracies, which is very different to everywhere else's. Yeah. In Britain, we don't have paid advertising on television. In America, you do. Do we want everywhere else to, it's not a great baseline democracy, America's democracy. Is that what we all want? But in terms of the kind of broader question about whether this works and what's the game with it, obviously a lot of this, my understanding, and because what Facebook will say is, and they've come out and said it, is Mark Zuckerberg said, this is less than 1% of our advertising spend. It's 0.5% is on online, yeah. And it's a free speech argument, which I find a really odd argument, because it's not an argument. It's not like someone saying you can't say things on Facebook. It's saying you can't pay for them to target it. I'm not quite sure. It's that kind of, it's quite an elision of free speech. This idea that actually my free speech, and which is also a very kind of American version of free speech. I have this free speech to pay money to target an advertisement at you, which I don't think is a lot of people's classical liberal understanding of free speech, to be honest. Is that what we really mean by free speech in democracy? And I think that's the big kind of issue with it, because and companies obviously as data, it's often called the new oil. Data is a huge big thing, and this is all part of that. And the thing with political, and I don't know the ins and outs, but I wouldn't be surprised. Partly, like, political adverts and political content is the kind of thing that gets people emotive. It's the kind of thing that brings in the kind of things that people react to.
Yeah.
And so that's really important, and that's what's happening in the British general election. The Conservative Party hired two very young guys called Topham Guireann, this kind of hotshot mid-20s New Zealanders. And their whole thing is about emotion. They're saying, they actually come out and say that. What they want to do is and anger is the strongest emotion. So if you're targeting adverts at people, they're getting angry, they're reacting, they're doing things online, and that's providing more and more data points. So there's a good reason why big tech companies would want to get involved in political advertising and having a lot of political content on their websites.
And Carole, a lot of your, several of your appearances this year have been with parliamentarians, basically invoking their participation in a response. Obviously, we've seen a Warren campaign bring forth a series of proposals. Where do you believe that we are in terms of, and we've had another year, through another year of GDPR, between regulation and legislative, where do you believe that we're at after that year of engaging across the world?
We're no closer to accountability. So I think, so I turned up in Dublin a few weeks ago because they had it's called the Grand International Committee, which is it's a great title. It's like the Grand Intergalactic Committee, isn't it? Of like non-appearances by Mark Zuckerberg, essentially. So they kind of hold these regular gigs. There's now 12 parliaments who've joined up, and every single time they invite Mark Zuckerberg to come and to give evidence and to talk about Facebook. And they represent, I think it's more than 500 million people across the world. And he never, ever shows up. And it just is this completely extraordinary situation, I think. And I think you're exactly right that so much of the debate is framed in American terms, in the American context, by American journalists and lawmakers. And actually, I completely agree with that. It's totally alien to actually most of the rest of the world. And I did a conference, actually, which was the Intergalactic Data Privacy Commissioners Conference. And so I went to that one, and I did a sort of like call to arms of like, just ban micro-targeting, it's up to you. Because they're the people in the room who they're the ones who should sort of enforce that. And I completely forgot what I was going to say. Oh yeah, no, there was
the intergalactic people. What did you say to them?
They had the Data Privacy Commissioner from New Zealand. It's this guy called John Edwards, and he was really interesting because in the wake of the Christchurch massacre, he did this post on, I think, Facebook, and he was completely furious, and he just ripped into them. And quite rightly. And I kind of it was wonderful to see that, because, most people in positions...
And obviously some of that was a live-streamed event.
And at the time, I have to say that I felt particularly angry about what happened there, because it wasn't just that this killer broadcast this massacre live on Facebook. And you think of as well of those Facebook moderators sitting in some shed somewhere looking at this content.
In Dublin, maybe.
But then what happened is that the copies of the video were seeded all across the world and were being uploaded to Facebook and to Google and to Twitter. Thousands and thousands of copies per minute. And although Facebook and Google and Twitter were taking them down, they weren't taking them down quickly enough. So without even looking for it, I came across it. I saw the video on Twitter without even looking for it. And, we could see this happening in real time. And this is a crime. In Britain, it's a crime. It's incitement to hatred. And we have laws against that. And, these companies have offices in Britain, they have offices in Ireland, and I think it's up to our law enforcement to have acted in that case. Because, there's really good research on contagion. And the fact is that thousands and thousands and thousands of people watch those videos, and in some way that they will have been affected. And so I think the correct response to that is the New Zealand response. And it is anger, and it is a belief that this cannot stand, and it is dangerous, and it is doing harm in real time. And that was my kind of call to the data privacy commissioners, which is that it's about safety. And this is a machinery. It's a global machinery that is not safe. And it is doing harm in real time right now, and we shouldn't tolerate it. And one thing I'm really pleased about is I think there's been a lot of polite talk about what do we do to regulate it, and that is I feel that, and it has changed just in a few weeks. I've been talking about banning political ads and being looked at like a crank for the last however long, and that now is at least that's suddenly in the conversation, and that's I think the level that we should be pushing for change at.
What's interesting, I thought, was the response from New Zealand, which is a country similar size of Ireland, was they really did put the platforms on the spot. And Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister there, basically forced the platforms, Google, Facebook, everybody to get around a table with some civil society groups and to talk about the damage that these platforms can do and how to mitigate against that. But then I think it speaks to the power of Facebook, and I wonder about Facebook and the Googles in this country. A few weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, they announced what was more details on what was called the Christchurch Call, which is essentially this pledge from the platforms to do X, Y, and Z if something like Christchurch were to happen again. And Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook was there, and so was Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister. And that was about, 6 or 7 months after the massacre? Yeah. But they were singing from the same hymn sheet at that point. And so I think it goes to to me it showed, when Facebook sees a threat, they can throw everything at it, and they can go on the charm offensive, and they can make New Zealand feel important and big, and give them a platform at the UN. And I don't doubt for a second the intentions of the folks in New Zealand. But it was very much, it went from a hey, you guys are the worst, to hey, you're doing your best, very, very quickly. And as a direct result of Carole's reporting, you talk about accountability as essentially a direct result of Carole's reporting. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission in the US, fined Facebook $5 billion this year. But then
and imagine if you got like 1%.
But as a result of that fine, Facebook became a more valuable company.
Yeah.
Its stock went up. Because you can't, if you really want to implement a punitive fine on Facebook, it's 20 times that. And so then I think the Data Protection Commissioner here, Helen Dixon, has got rightly a lot of praise for all the investigations she's launched, etc. But I think the real test is going to be, is there actually going to be the fines when they come, if they will be to the maximum level that they should be. And especially in a small country like Ireland, which is dependent on, as they say, Facebook for jobs, how that will come into it. Because will Facebook, unlike Facebook has to stay in the US because it's the US.
Yeah.
They're an American company. Facebook could move out of Ireland in the morning if they thought, well, we actually have a more friendly data commissioner in somewhere else.
Ireland is obviously at the centre of a lot of these flows. Our data commissioner does occupy a central role under GDPR legislation. We do have content moderating of a significant scale going on here. What is there imagining beyond the scale of a fine Helen Dixon could levy? Is there a way of imagining a wholly different engagement from Ireland in this world?
Oh, that's a tough one. I was going to bounce that to you, hence I looked at you. I think it is. What is interesting, I guess, is someone like, comes back to Ireland quite frequently, is just how important Ireland is in all of this.
Yeah.
I think we can always forget this. Like not just Facebook and Google, but almost every single big tech company is domiciled in Ireland in some size, shape, or form. And obviously, it's good to see that they're putting some more resources in the Information's Commissioner, but there is that thing. It doesn't seem, there's been some interesting FOI disclosures, I think, in the Irish press over the last year. I've only picked them up now and again of correspondence between Facebook and Irish legislators.
It's chummy, right?
It's chummy. It feels very chummy, and it feels like there's that huge imbalance as well, because it's it's a small country. We're very dependent on their revenue. We're not dependent on their taxes. They don't pay tax
great
here.
They're here at all.
Exactly. Yeah. And if we were to do something to upset them now, they might go away now, and we could be in trouble. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem, because people aren't. We not only it's the imbalance is so huge between, say, someone who's a lawmaker, from an Irish lawmaker, maybe a junior minister or just an average TD, and somebody who's a Facebook bigwig. They're in kind of different worlds, and I think my sense is Facebook are very, much about this. Facebook are quite aware of this as well themselves. They know, they're a much bigger company than almost any country in the world. So they've got huge
charm
power.
offences, or in Carole's case, they'll try strong arm you and sue you, threaten to sue you before you publish your story, right?
Yeah. Actually, the thing I was going to say...
They didn't try the charm on you at all, Carole.
I've never had the charm. Not even once. And actually, the thing I was just thinking, which is kind of curious, because you were talking about, is I do find, actually, of all of the characters involved, the one who I do find compelling is Nick Clegg. Because the sort of the rationalizations that he's gone through are just, on a human level, I find so interesting. Because I met him at an event in the summer. He was doing a panel, and they took a question from me, and I asked a question about the data from the referendum. And the Facebook data, essentially. So the whole thing is, we know...
In the Brexit referendum.
In the Brexit referendum, but also in the Brexit referendum, but also in the 2016 US presidential election. Facebook is a crime scene. I mean, these were massive crimes carried out on them. In Britain, there were these multiple crimes, overspending, coordination. In America, we know that it was attacked by Russia. But this crime scene is sort of totally closed off from us because it's held by this private company. Anyway, I asked Nick Clegg about that, and he sort of started frothing at the mouth almost. He said, there's no evidence of Cambridge Analytica had any involvement in this. This is a conspiracy theory. And it was just, I found it really interesting, because this man is in charge of this global policy on disinformation and control at Facebook. And he sat on this panel and he called me a conspiracy theorist, which is the attacks I've had right from the beginning of this story. And I think that he willfully misinterpreted the question. And the fact is that Nick Clegg was a prominent anti-Brexiteer. And now he has gone to work for a company that is involved in manipulation and propaganda and disinformation, and not just at a British scale, but at a global scale. And so this bubble of Silicon Valley that enables, to go back to the question that you asked Donie before about how these people think, there is this reflective bubble whereby these individuals who, extraordinarily rich and successful and clever, and who've built these companies and worked there, they are in such deep denial. They are in such deep denial about what this sort of monster they've created is doing. And I do think that taking them out, puncturing that bubble, is a really sort of important part of it. And I think shame should be a part of it. I think Nick Clegg really should be ashamed.
I mean, when you think of, and that's not to say, I know some people at Facebook, particularly that they've hired in recent years, who are working on tackling the misinformation problem, and they're good people, right? And they're working hard in their teams. But then they see a policy or announced from another part of the organization that says, oh, well, lies are fine once they come from politicians. And they're looking at that and saying, well, what have we been doing? But when you talk about the moral and sort of ethical gymnastics of Nick Clegg, I mean, he's the guy. There's articles from just a year ago of him talking about how lies helped Brexit happen. You know, the lies on the side of the bus.
He wrote a book. He literally wrote a book which said that.
You know, and then his argument says, and even though I disagree with, you know, the lies, he says we should have it out there so basically the news media can fact check them. That's the same news media that Facebook and Google has helped destroy through taking advertising dollars. But it's quite
but this
incredible.
cognitive dissonance
exactly.
it's quite extraordinary.
Did you read? He had an amazing press release out about a month ago. He said Facebook. What Facebook does is we're like the tennis umpires. We line the court and we make sure everyone's rackets are fine and the net looks fine. But that's it. We don't do anything else. Which I thought it just showed this, like, that level of cognitive dissonance was just remarkable.
And I've seen in the US organizations that have been doing great work on analyzing what actually Facebook, how it's impacting people, what's happening in terms of misinformation coordinated. And Facebook eventually tries to bring them into the tent, right?
Yeah.
And they'll pay them, sponsor them. It'll say no strings attached.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe after this panel, Ireland's Edge might get a call from Facebook saying, hey, do you want some money for next year? No strings attached. But that's what
Maybe
happens.
they'd come on.
Well, that's what happened. And again, that goes back to, you know, I think Facebook and Google are lauded quite a bit for pumping money into local journalism. There's a lot of, I think, even here in Ireland. But then again, what you're doing there is they're giving a few, you know, it's pittance for these companies, for Google and Facebook. But you're also essentially saying you're giving, you know, a pretty good guarantee that a lot of these news organizations aren't going to dig too carefully into Facebook.
Well, the biggest journalism conference in the world is held every year in Perugia and is sponsored by Facebook and Google. They pay for thousands of journalists from across the world to go there. Never once have I had an invitation. And more than that, I actually thought, I'm going to propose a panel on the power of the Silicon Valley tech platforms and their role in the journalistic ecosystem or something. But guess what? That kind offer was never taken up. So I mean, I actually find that pretty sinister. And I think I went to a conference at the weekend, Arabic Investigative Journalists, and that was sponsored by Facebook. And all power to the journalistic organisers who let me sit on the stage and liberally slag them off for the extended period. So I think it's one thing to take the money, but you've got to be absolutely rigorous in having a firewall there.
And in that sense, I mean, we've seen like there's a level of regulatory engagement, as you say, between employees going from one side of that fence to another. There is a level of academic capture, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, I've been pushing you've been describing them as supranational, you've been describing kind of individual politicians as not up to them. The only hint I've got of a solution is the withdrawal of a social license, which comes from us on a social license front. What do ye see as anything that resembles an answer? Or does this just play out?
I mean, I think I kind of haven't heard it expressed like that before, social license. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Its legitimacy rests upon us, the people, accepting it. And I think, this is the point, is that the company, like Facebook, is literally not going to hit itself over the head and break itself up. That is not going to happen. And as you say, all of the governments depend upon using these, and parties depend upon using the same tools. So it really is up to kind of we, the people, grassroots resistance to it in some ways, and I think not being okay with any of this is part of it, and I think not being okay with the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has secret meetings with Donald Trump, like that is not okay, and And so I suppose that's the sort of thing that I hang on to, is that it's not, you go to the fact that it's just like unbelievable that it is in a UN report that Facebook was responsible for radicalizing people that led to this massacre in Myanmar, not just a massacre, a genocide. I mean, it's just extraordinary, isn't it?
And just maybe to take that cue there from Carole in terms of moving maybe from a very Anglo-American view of these companies in a, there's a splintering to, I mean, we've seen Iran in effect come off the internet over the course of the last week or two. Like, we have, obviously China has all of its own, I mean, Facebook hasn't managed to penetrate in any fashion. Amazon hasn't managed to penetrate. There's a whole series of other global giants. There is the potential for regionalization of the internet. How some of the debates that we're having here, which at least are about a standard of privacy, won't be happening in other places.
Yeah, Russia's tried to do that, essentially create, I mean, technically it's actually a pretty hard thing to do, and there's a lot of ways to get around it. So I think in terms of, people who want to see an open internet, they have that on their side, but obviously it has been turned off in Iran. The social media platforms, a lot of them have been blocked. I do think that, you're right. As we talk here about the US and the UK, I think the major corporations, I mean, I'm lucky, I guess, in the extent that if I call Facebook, if CNN's calling, they'll answer, right? And they spend quite a lot of money in getting back to me in a promptly fashion every day, sort of rooting out stuff for me. But, I was in a room recently with a lot of journalists from Eastern Europe, and, they can go weeks without, doing investigative journalism, finding misuse, something really bad. They just won't hear back.
But this is why, and actually this is why I made the effort to go to this conference in Jordan, because I think international solidarity at this point is really, really key. And these journalists in the Middle East doing this incredibly brave and important work, and absolutely they're further ahead in terms of seeing the effects of disinformation, being the victims of disinformation. They had a guy they put on in the first panel with somebody from Facebook, and he was a journalist in Lebanon, and he had been doxed and targeted. His children's face had been put all over Facebook, and he couldn't get them to take it down, even though he was being sort of physically threatened. So I feel really strongly about this thing of there's this responsibility on American journalists, particularly, to be also not just fighting with what's happening in your own country, but realising that, sorry, Donie, but you've also got to fight for all these other, you have the moral responsibility, I'm sorry about that, to also sort it out for Pakistan.
I'll let them know. I mean, that is, obviously a lot of it, because America is a continent, the coverage is very inward looking, a lot of it, particularly going to 2020, it's going to be just hyper-focused on American politics. I should mention, what would Facebook say if they were in the room? If you want me to put on a fake Facebook spokesperson.
Go on.
I think what Facebook will rarely say publicly, but will say privately, is that you have Carole Cadwalladr and Peter Geoghegan and Donie O'Sullivan up here, and they're from media outlets, and they have bee in their bonnet because their industry is going down the tube, it's not making any money, and we're super successful over here, and they're just jealous. And they're trying to pin all of life's woes on us, right? And to a certain extent, there has been coverage where, it's gone over the line. I do think Facebook sometimes gets called out for things that Google is doing and Amazon's doing. But at the same time, you do have Facebook. I think Facebook have to own it, because they spent years cultivating the brand of Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. This whole thing about lying in political ads, it's actually been a policy on Facebook's books for over a year. But Nick
Maybe
Clegg,
just explain that.
So there's been the whole debate the past few months of you can lie as a politician in the US or around the world, in the UK, you can place an ad, and as long as it's not calling for violence or something like that, it can say whatever it wants. It could be a total blatant lie and put $1 million behind it and pay for it to target people. That's actually a policy that's been on at Facebook for about a year. But Nick Clegg sort of inexplicably brought it up in a speech in September. So like Facebook actually leans into, to borrow the Sheryl Sandberg phrase, leans into a lot of these issues and turns itself into the conduit of which we talk about the open internet. So I do think it's worth mentioning that Facebook and Google in some ways have become the sort of shorthand for the internet. So I think,
But they are the internet.
Yes.
I mean, there's a reason for that, isn't it? Is that, that is where most of us are spending our time, and it's where most of us are getting our information from. Can I ask Donie a question?
Ooh, go for it.
Do Facebook, do they like Google and the rest of it, do they go on a bit of a charm offensive with you? Is there like, do you want to come out for dinner? We want to discuss off the record.
Of course, yeah.
And do you, because I think off the record briefings are really kind of evil and pernicious, actually.
Yeah.
Because they are just trying to get into your brain.
Yeah, I think they say, who's this Irish guy here? We'll take him up for Guinness. No, I mean, I speak to folks from companies off the record, but I think, look, I think they're so sophisticated, in fact, that they know, what, in terms of the reporters that cover them most closely, what way to treat them. And I know that from a lot of smaller news organizations, and not particularly small, but like from Huffington Post, like still big organizations, but I know that the spokespeople for these companies will shout at them down the phone and try and intimidate them. Not necessarily Facebook, not naming any names, but so there is this, they're as you've seen, they're very happy to play mean when needs be.
Peter, maybe just again on that point of off-the-record briefings, I mean, if we bring it back just to the UK for a moment and see kind of a source close to, sources close to a lot of people. Two questions really is, one about the journalistic standards, which even in the mainstream press, which have enabled that, and maybe to talk to that a little bit. And then also, what does this look like as we go through the years in terms of the results of campaigns like this? So we are going through, as you say, a very particular general election that we haven't seen, in some sense, this blatancy before. You could say in Ireland that we're taking some refuge in the hope of a Brexit in name only outcome after this. But at the end of campaigns like that, how actually likely, once those emotions have started and wheels are in motion, do you get back to something that looks like Brexit in name only?
I think we'll try and take it all together. I think what's happened is we have a tendency always to try and fight the last war. We often look at what happened last time. So like I think a lot of journalists who are covering this general election are looking at what's gone wrong in the past. Who's bought an ad on Facebook and all. So we do have a tendency to always look at what's happened in the past, which isn't always the best guide for what's going to happen in the future and how things have changed. And I think to take the first point, but I think it's kind of related to the second about, well, do we go back to normal? We had these these rafts of, a source close to number 10, Dominic, who might be called Dominic Cummings and might have had his email address. And the way that was reported was absolutely farcical. And I think, how slow the British press, Open Democracy, we published a lot of stories on it. I wrote about it in The Guardian. Peter Oborne wrote a huge piece in Open Democracy that went viral, calling out people for this. But I thought it was remarkable it took so long for that to happen. This went on for weeks and weeks. Yeah. But the big problem, I think, with that isn't just the unnamed sources, it's actually that how we get our news has changed. So, back in the day, so when, say, a journalist, and think of it in the best faith, I think the part of the problem I have with social media is it tends almost everybody towards bad faith. It's almost like a bad faith production machine. It's hard not to engage online in a way that doesn't make you feel like you read the worst into. I always find myself trying to pull myself back from that. But what's happened is the big change, I think, is that if you look at, say, like senior BBC journalists, I'm not going to name, but the big BBC journalists who are often attacked on Twitter for what they say. back in the day, say they set up a Facebook, or say they set up a Twitter account, I don't think they would have thought at the time, actually, this is going to be where the news cycle is generated from. And the BBC doesn't regulate those Twitter accounts. And you could say, oh, that's fair enough. But increasingly, the news cycle is set from a few Twitter accounts first thing in the morning. And it's set anonymously. It's set in the 140 and 280 characters with no context.
Yeah.
And this is a huge problem. So before, when people used to get their news from the 6 o'clock bulletin, the 10 o'clock bulletin, front page of newspapers, now it's getting led in the morning by tweets from a few journalists. And I understand why that's happening, because that's increasing where large numbers of people are getting their news. And at the moment, we're trying to firefight backwards from that. And there's a kind of rush, I think almost like collectively as journalists, we all want to put new information in the public domain. You know, I personally, I don't know about you, I've tried less and less to ever say something that says a source has said something to me about something, because I feel like that's kind of, it plays into this role, into this world. But there's a huge rush for newness, and it means that things are moving much quicker than they were before. So false information and mistruths. So many of those number 10 stories were nonsense. You know, Leo Varadkar did not have an argument with Boris Johnson on the phone. Boris Johnson did not have a stand-up row with Angela Merkel. All these things weren't true, but by the time the mistruth had come out, it was way, way far down that the whole ship had sailed. Like, and there's a huge, I think that's very easy to manipulate. It's so easy now for politicians, and not just politicians, anybody really, to manipulate the news cycle. I think companies do it too. Facebook can do it. Anybody can do it. You can use the news cycle in a way and I think journalists, have really struggled to understand this and to understand their role in it. I think partly we're all kind of slightly collectively, we don't know what to do with it. We probably all feel a little bit guilty about it too. We're both gloomy about the industry, but also a little bit like, okay, maybe I'm contributing, but how do I do this? What's the etiquette for this? And I think that also speaks slightly oddly to the kind of question of what happens next, for Britain, for everywhere else. So it's like, how do you go backwards? I think we're not really going to go backwards. That's not the nature. The nature of humanity is we don't go backwards. And the idea that there's going to be some moment, which is a bit like we're having this entire general election campaign, that's let's one soundbite over and over again, and let's get Brexit done. And I think we all collectively, a lot of journalists fall into this trap as well of talking about, once Brexit is done, then we will do X, Y, and Z. And there's a whole new world. The sunlit uplands open up, and everything will go back to kind of the way it was before. We'll have all these debates about policy and all the rest of it. But that's kind of, I think the genie is now completely out of the bottle. People don't want to talk about, they don't want to talk about things like healthcare, really. They want to get emotional about things. And, like I started off in doing investigative journalism about really kind of like a lot of stuff about councils, a lot of stuff about public procurement policy, a lot of stuff about PPI. It's really hard to get people interested in that stuff now. And that really matters.
Yeah.
Like, Carillion, which is one of the biggest companies in Britain, collapsed.
Yeah.
A lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of people lost jobs. And one of the reasons it collapsed was no one was really looking at it. But it's really hard if you're in a newsroom to get your news editor interested in, they've got this PPI problem. Who cares? We got, here's number 10 sources. This amazing thing. Let's go with that.
But also as well, I actually always appreciate your input, Peter, in that you kind of call out the Westminster political journalists quite a lot, and because there is this just groupthink. It feels
really feel
so
there is.
insular,
yeah.
And it feels particularly in terms of, for example, how Brexit affects Ireland and Northern Ireland. You don't even hear from that perspective, and it is again, it's a bit like the Silicon Valley self-reinforcing bubble. And that, as you say, it just sort of like feeds off each other, and it drives the news agenda, and that becomes the news.
And you see, I thought we saw it as well with the disinformation the last week. There's a kind of, for some, I almost feel like there's a kind of cynicism is to be seen, not skepticism, cynicism is almost seen as a healthy trait. Oh no, you wouldn't want to worry too much about that.
Yes. It's like, I think one of my greatest crimes actually for my critics is the fact that I've been really earnest for the last 3 years. And I used to actually write really jolly funny pieces. And you just don't really feel like it anymore. It just doesn't feel like an appropriate response. But
there is something, I think, in the British class system about that too. To actually care too much about something shows yourself to be a bit of an ingenue, a bit of somebody, someone who's a bit of a newcomer. It's not seen as the done thing to actually care too much.
I know, but it is, of course. I mean, and then you go back to it, and it's actually there's a lot of, particularly that the sort of, if you live in London, if you're of a certain, if you own a house, you are really insulated. And I think it is. I really, that sort of socio-economic part of it and the way that feeds into the reporting of these issues, I do think is a factor.
The last time, I believe, Mark Zuckerberg was in Washington, apart from his dinner, in that he was actually there to talk about a currency proposal in effect, and to be, so I mean, we're talking here about the advertising model, but if we see the extension of these companies and, you know, with the same potential for network effects and monopolization into, like we were talking about sustainable food, I mean, we weren't even talking about food tech, but, you know, if we look at the investments that are being made through industries, whether it be banking, other aspects of financialization, indeed into food tech. This is an expanding ecosystem and the complexity of the organizations going back into, even to your point, Donie, and you know, kind of one arm of an organization, which we might have some suspicions is some form of info washing or something. But just the complexity going through the too big to fail argument, the drive into the economic nationalist of, you know, if you don't have us, you've got nothing against China in the broader.
Yeah, I think that, I think that it really goes to show you that despite all this sort of talk of antitrust and breaking these companies up, they're not seriously thinking that that's going to happen. You know, Facebook, for the past few months, has gone into dating apps. They're trying to launch a currency, which they say is independent and they don't control. Google's gone into, launched a video game streaming service last week. I mean, these are all different industries that right now there are some standalone businesses there, you know, independent companies, and yet you see the sort of that overreach of the Silicon Valley major corporations coming in there. But I just lost my trail of thought as I was sorry. Save me.
I mean, it's kind of what was really interesting about their currency. It just seems a bit dead in the water already, doesn't it? I mean, and that's quite interesting because Facebook doesn't really fail at anything, does it?
Thank you for saving me. I remember what I was going to say. It's coming back to when you talk about these companies as nation states. You know, Facebook says it has 2.2 billion users now. Whether it actually has 2.2 billion users is a whole other story that needs to be uncovered. But it's setting up essentially a Supreme Court now. They're calling it the Council on something or other. But so for now, for decisions around content moderation, they're trying to set up, again, an independent body of experts, which if there's something that's really, you know, setting policies that could be really controversial, that they'll have these experts, this Supreme Court, if you will, actually make the decision so Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have to. Which, you know, in theory, if you put that on paper and say, okay, you're getting the right people in the room to talk about this, that's good. But it also allows Facebook to sort of wash their hands of it and say, well, our Supreme Court General up there told us that that's what we're going to do, so don't blame us, you know?
The three of you are also social media personalities in your own right. You know, this is an oxygen in your day. You have a followership. You know, you have an activist element to what you do. Taking the evolution of your careers as investigative journalists, how are you all managing that?
Really badly. I mean, I have a kind of interesting background in this because I hated social media. I think I wrote the first article on Facebook in Britain, and I just to essentially you know, to say how awful this new thing was. And I wanted to have nothing to do with it. And then I was kind of forced out onto Twitter when I started writing these stories, because I was just sort of like, I've got to get people to read them. And then it became a kind of investigative tool, because I found people finding the interesting thing and I connected. And then, and now I find it really difficult, because actually now it's that you kind of have the responsibility of a news organisation, and so anything I do wrong is like, and you know, of course, mostly you're just sort of like doing something like, you know, ordering a coffee and, like doing something, and you go, shit, oh no, what have I done this time? Delete. And, but also the thing I was kind of reflecting on the other
That's very knowing laughter on the other
yeah,
side.
Hold on it. But the thing I was sort of reflecting on the other day is just this thing about how I was reading this thing by an academic, and it was about the effect of technology on teens discovering that the development of their sexual identity, actually it was. And it was like, actually, the way that you can kind of adopt other identities online seems to be having, like really interesting impacts. And it really made me think about the fact that actually I've spent like the last 3 years being quite online in that sense. And I suddenly had this feeling of like, here I am, I'm trying to report on this tech dystopia, and I've really had to inhabit it.
Yeah.
And and that's been good in some ways. It's empowering. You kind of feel that you have this agency, but at the same time, you also become this kind of complex site of like hatred and abuse, and actually also praise. I think they're both kind of difficult. And I was like, what weird things has this done to my head? And I suspect it has done. I mean, technology changes us, and it's changing us in really interesting, complex ways. And just sort of thinking about that for a moment just quite alarmed me, actually. Made me want to get offline.
Because we're really the guinea pig generation as well.
Yeah.
Like, because we grew up. I'm always really conscious of like growing up with, I grew up at an Irish house with one phone that was in the house. There was no internet. There was none of those things. And like to grow up and then to try. And I think I almost feel like we're probably the worst generation. We didn't grow up with any kind of sense of, and I don't know what it's like for young people growing up now, but any sense of I think with boundaries and stuff around this stuff, I think adults are actually, I think we can often get really kind of moral panicky about young people and what are young people doing online. But if you look at like Facebook is full of older people. Yeah. That's just reality. Most people who engage with political content. I recently did a load of, I'm finishing this book, and I was chatting to loads of people who run, younger people who run like what are kind of right-wing hyper-partisan websites, the kind of websites that basically spread conspiracy theories. And if you chat to them, they're young and they're really savvy, and they're like, no, our audience is old, and we're just trying to get people who are, on Facebook, and there's a socialization that goes on online for older people too. And I don't mean just, like we're journalists and it's part of partly it's part of what your job is, but I think our generation is the one actually that's least well adapted, I think, to this. Like I don't know about Carole and Donie, but it's also just exhausting as well.
Yeah.
Like, I found myself more and more like that sense of like struggling to find that. Recently I had to write something about like what was something you wanted from the future or something. And I was like, I wouldn't mind being able to think a bit more, like that. And I think I'm not the only person who probably feels like that. That sense of space to have like kind of ideas that were beyond instrumental ideas, beyond just this idea to that idea. And it's really difficult. Like partly it's because you're expected to be online all the time, being a journalist, and that's always been part of the job, being a journalist, and being a journalist in an online world where people expect more content but there's less journalists. Then that's the reality of journalism. So there's always going to be an element of that, but it's also very exhausting. I think it's very hard. I think it takes a toll on anybody who engages with it in that way. And
I think when you talk, I think certainly when you talk about media literacy, a lot of it does focus around young people, teenagers, but it is sort of normally the crazy auntie and uncle you might have that are sharing the most batshit insane stuff on Facebook, and that is because it all looks the same. An RT or Irish Times article looks the same as something
from RT.
Or a guy in his blog. When you speak about guinea pigs, though, I do think that I can't imagine being in secondary school here now and having the phone and always having that impulse to be online. So I do think in terms of the effects of social media, I think it's like kids right now, especially there's like, across the US and here too, I'm sure, there are high school and college age students who have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers. But here's the thing, there are tens of thousands of them. So right now there's not an insignificant amount of young people that have this huge following on social media. Not all of them can be famous when they grow up, right? So I think like the impact of having this massive following as a kid, and then wait, this isn't making me money. I have to go to college, and I think there's all these impacts that we'll see playing out in the decades.
I'm going to call it a line there. There's no good time here to call this.
On that cheery note.
On that very cheery
all
note.
doomed.
But I am very conscious we've thrown a lot at you this afternoon. I'm so delighted to have had these 3 participants here, and I thank all of them for their efforts to get here. And I thank all of you. And there's just so much going on around the town here now for the rest of the evening, for the day.
No tweeting. No tweeting.
No tweeting. I know
No,
what stays
they're all
in
going
Dingle.
on digital
What
detox.
happens in Dingle stays in Dingle, okay?
And for those of you, we would love to see you back here in the morning. Anybody who is there. Thank you.